well, we can talk about this in a second. I'll go live first. Clicking the blue go live button. And we're live. It's Sunday, June 20th, Father's Day. 5:04 p.m. We are a little bit late, which would normally make Ben very anxious. But I don't give a fuck. And so, and it's just me. It's the end of Kate Week. And we're ending Kate Week with a bang. We have Professor Kate Levine from Cardozo Law School and an old friend of mine here to celebrate the end of Kate Week. And so, we don't have fun anymore, but we have Kate Levine and the end of Kate Week and the soon to be the start of Munch Week. I will tell you all about that in a second.
Sounds more fun than Kate Week.
It's about, we're gonna do live cooking show on the show. First, Ben's gonna make cheese curds, and then each of us are gonna cook something, I think, one day of each week, and then we're gonna make mozzarella out of the cheese curds on Friday. It's like a giant, it really is like improv here, Kate. Like, I don't know.
Are you gonna have chef guests?
We should. We are like, I'm looking for a cheese maker, like, to basically come on Friday. I had a line to one, or I thought I did, but my cheese maker connections are not what they used to be, apparently. And so, but we'll figure it out. But anyways, Kay Levine, welcome to the show. It's so nice to have you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So I was going to kind of start out by asking you to describe your scholarship, and I'm going to drop a link to the chat to your SSRM page, which I think is quite excellent. Oh, no, I just put a weird, oh, no, I ruined everything. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out, the tech glitches are part of the charm of the show. But Kate is a professor at Cardozo Law School, and she specializes in criminal law. And since I've known you, you have, and this was far before George Floyd, but it was like in the wake of Trayvon Martin and a lot of like other types of kind of atrocities that have been very public against Black Americans. And you had been at the fore of kind of fighting against a lot of these things and writing against a lot of these things in the U.S. And so I'm kind of interested to hear what your take on the last couple years have been, and and how you kind of came to the conclusions you came to before other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure some others came to those conclusions around the same time, but the work that I do has mostly, what it does is it looks at how the criminal law or the criminal legal system treats police when they are accused of committing a crime or not. And I started looking at it, for me, for whatever the trigger was, the choking death of Eric Garner here in New York, in Staten Island. And that coincided or was close to the non-indictment of the killing of Mike Brown, non-indictment of Darren Wilson for the killing of Mike Brown, which really kind of launched a lot of the modern day movements, Black Lives Matter type movements, to protest police brutality. And I think I started off in the same place as a lot of people, which was just, devastated and outraged by what the police were doing. But at the same time, I have always had a desire to see the criminal legal system reduced, to see the criminal legal system's footprint reduced, and to see a lot of people who are currently in prison freed. So I kind of had those two thoughts at one time, right? I want to see the police stop doing these things, and I want to see the power of the criminal legal system and what I call and consider our American addiction to criminal law sort of go away.
So what do you mean by like addiction to criminal law, though? Like, very specifically, do you think it is a literal addiction, like we like get some type of pleasure out of retribution?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's an addiction. So I think, broadly, I when I use the term broadly, I think it's an addiction in the sense of when someone does something bad or something bad happens, a lot of people's first thought, a lot of people's first desire is put them in prison, prosecute them. And this is how we've ended up with, one of the largest prison systems in the world, crazy levels of mass incarceration. And of course, all the racial and racist dynamics that go along with that. So that's on the one hand. Although I'll also say, and this came up for me a lot during the trial during the recent trial against the officer who killed George Floyd, there was lots of outrage and desire to see this man punished, which I could completely understand. And then there was a lot of sort of this breathless reporting, this almost like this enjoyment, as you said, that I saw being taken in the trial, sort of the dissection of every moment of the trial, and the almost as though people were watching a television show, a Law and Order episode. And so I do see somewhat an addiction on another level, which is sort of a media addiction that's also, of course, fueled by viewership. Just sort of this looking at the criminal legal system or looking at these trials as though they're entertainment and spectacle, and sort of, I think, forgetting that on the other end of that is prison, which to me, and I think a lot of others, is akin to torture. And you may believe that someone belongs there, but I don't think it's ever sort of a fun game to watch someone being sent there. So I do see it as an addiction in this sort of way in which we're able to sort of separate ourselves and completely dehumanize sort of all the players involved, and really not think about what does prison mean.
Yeah. So I think that that's a super interesting point, and I think that there is how do we ever, like, that fundamental kind of human decision to focus on, or kind of impulse, I guess I would say, because it doesn't feel like a decision, an impulse to kind of focus on some type of retribution, or to, like, there are various levels of it. Like, there are, like, string him up, like some type of extra legal mob type of force, right? And if something someone does is bad enough, that is what is, like, people try to, like, call for. Or if, like, the system is not strong enough, that is what people call for. And then there is, like, but it is one of the things that has always struck me that is really strange and kind of hypocritical, or at least kind of, like, recursive about looking to the legal system to solve the problem of these kind of police killings, is that the entire idea of the police is that they are the enforcement mechanism of the legal system, right? And
Right.
so, like, this is, like, part of the whole problem. And so then when you put them, like, obviously, okay, mob justice is, like, but, like, at the end of the day, like, prison is bad for everyone. Maybe even worse for police, but I mean, it's really, like, I mean, it's whatever. But, like, it's bad. Like, and so how do you kind of, like, if you're looking to do, it's just, like, a really interesting problem. If you're looking to do police reform, how do you separate that from prison reform, or a reform of the actual judicial mechanism that puts people in prison? Does that
Right.
make sense? I mean,
I
like,
think so.
this,
I mean, there's a lot in that question, but I think I'll just sort of think about the last piece of it, because this is where I've been really concentrating my work. My goal, and this doesn't have to be the goal of people who study or long for an end to police brutality, but putting myself in the camp, I assume the great majority of people who want to see a reduction or the end of police brutality, is, okay, what will work? What's likely to work? And just as with many sort of terrible things, I don't think that criminal prosecution is the answer or the way to make it work. And that's on many levels. I'm seeing some in the chat, some of what I've seen a lot, which makes a lot of sense, right? Police do often escape charges. They get a lot more credibility from judges and juries, right? No one ever thinks they're lying, even though, there's a term, test-lying, that was actually invented because police perjure themselves so often, that test-lying refers to police lying, right? So if there's a phrase or a word that that is defines this act that's got to be happening a lot, and yet police still get a tremendous amount of credibility when they take the witness stand. So there are all these hurdles to prosecuting the police, and I think that's what a lot of people have been upset by and object to. I have sort of like a separate concern. I mean, obviously, I think, as much as possible, criminal defendants should be treated equally, to the extent that's ever humanly possible in our system that relies so much on power and money. But I also don't think that the idea of the police or police officers as sort of individual rogue bad apples is getting it anywhere to the root of the problem. And I actually think it could slow what I see as a solution. So what happens is, you get it, sometimes they're killings that are just outrageous and they seem as though they're done by a sociopath, right? And I think we saw this with Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. You saw it with the shooting of Walter Scott in the back as he ran away. And sometimes, frankly, police are just doing their job. And I think that's a lot more often. And by doing their job, I mean, police officers are part of a system where they're told, you are in danger, your life is in danger, you're carrying a gun, you're in a dangerous situation, you shoot to kill, right? And then fear or power or whatever drives them into situations where people get harmed. And unfortunately, a lot of these situations start out as a mental health call, as a traffic stop. And what I'd like to see is police being removed from or taken out of these situations. So to me, the recognition that it's policing itself that's rotten. It's not individual officers. I mean, it is sometimes, but they're a product of a rotten system. And so we need to reduce the power of that system. And just one last thing I'll say is, I think what you see is an officer gets convicted or charged, and the police used to be super defensive of them, but now what they're doing is saying, oh, this guy's a bad apple. It isn't reflected all on the Minneapolis Police Department, right? This is just one bad guy, and then they don't have to make changes. So what I want to see is big changes to the system.
So let's talk about that. Like, what are the big changes? I mean, I think that one of the big changes, if I had and I think you just touched on it, would be, and I am not a criminal law person, so this is just like something that I've spitballed, but I've always thought that there should be exactly as you say, there are police responding to things that are not about policing, that are about mental health crises. And specific, I mean, either it's, well, this is very variable when it ends up being around domestic violence, but sometimes it's around domestic violence, and sometimes, but that's kind of the edge zone of do you send police, do you send mental health specialists, do you send both or something? But you're completely right. I would say in a lot of places like New York, police end up spending so much of their time doing cleanup of people that are living on streets and are homeless, or doing some type of kind of and disturbances that are around that, or disturbances that are around people that are elderly people that are senile, have wandered out of their home, or children that have run away. I don't know, there's just a million things that just doesn't strike you what you would want police doing. Traffic stops is an excellent, and Radley Belko has been on the show and talked about that a lot, which is the end of traffic stops.
And I think one of the guests is talking about a paper by Jordan Woods. I don't remember exactly what it's called. I'm not sure. They call it The Myth of the Dangerous Traffic Stop, but Jordan Woods has done a lot of work on basically saying police actually, without meaning to, create the danger that they're afraid of when they do traffic stops. And actually, some places like Berkeley are now saying police may not do traffic stops unless you're only allowed to pull someone over in a car if you're suspected of a crime that has nothing to do with a traffic violation. In other words, no more police for taillight out, for running a red light, for speeding. It's got to be an independent, so you can, I suppose, unfortunately, drugs are still illegal. They shouldn't be anywhere, but to the extent that they are, police could probably still pull people over for that. But hopefully some of this, police may not stop people for traffic violations. The downside to this, and Kate, you may know more about this than I do, but is that what will replace it is sort of the big brother camera enforcement and things like that. So there's definitely reason to be concerned. But getting the police out of traffic stops will certainly lead to much fewer harm to police, because police are not harmed very often. That's one of the big like myths, is that being a police officer is so dangerous, and it's not dangerous, but compared to a lot of other jobs, it's actually not that dangerous. But to the extent that police are injured and hurt and killed, it often happens in traffic stop situations. So reduced police injuries to police, and also to civilians who are pulled over initially for something, and then they get suspected of something else, and then there's a weapon, and then the police shoot them.
There's a very different, well, a lot of this is that, I mean, to answer your question about the privacy and like this gets into like Fourth Amendment search kind of stuff, honestly, and this is, but like in my mind, the dangerous zone between deciding to police this type of stuff with cameras and whatever else is a fine trade-off, as long as as long as like kind of like how it's done is a very strict rule between whatever platform the government decides to kind of like use for this and tracking people across other types of things. So for example, let's imagine that they're doing like Eric Adams's Easy Pass, like, or like whatever else, right? And there is a real question there of like whether these are state or private documents, whether Easy Pass is like a state or private agency, and thus whether it requires a warrant to kind of have these types of like availability. I mean, like you can check someone's alibi, you can check someone's whereabouts really quickly. It can be very invasive, and I do feel like that, like, on the one hand, traffic enforcement of speeding is, there's just no downside. The only downside of traffic enforcement of speeding is I think that Americans are very much used to like a liberty mindset that allows them to do whatever until they're caught. Like that's like
That's true.
right?
That's
Like
true.
I
All of
mean,
a sudden,
like because I go
yeah.
to France and people are like fine with like
I
these
got
traffic
so many
cams.
tickets in Italy because I didn't realize about
So
the
many
traffic cams.
tickets.
Yeah.
That makes me feel
know.
better. We're
So,
both
well,
rule
yeah.
breakers.
Yeah, and I just both rule breakers, and I'm not going to call you stupid, but I feel stupid because I just was like, oh, nothing's going to happen, and lo and behold, I got a bunch of tickets.
I got so many tickets.
Yeah.
And my friend, I was driving my friend's car, and she was like, she just sent me all of the tickets, and I was like, oh damn, those are all me. Like that, I was like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, but anyways, I do think that there is this kind of, the perfect enforcement idea is an interesting idea around traffic, and there's just no need. The only other thing, and I will like mention this briefly, around traffic enforcement is that and this is not actually, I don't really understand why this is a lever against using cameras or kind of speed cams to like do enforcement, but is the idea that like so much revenue is derived by these tickets. It actually seems to me like people would be more like kind of like it'd be better to have like a 24/7 kind of a speed anyways. But
well, I think one problem with traffic violations right now that may not end up being an issue if it was speeding and traffic cams, but is that a lot of like what often another problem with our criminal system is that someone will get pulled over for speeding or for having let's forget speeding. Let's imagine it's just like a smaller thing, a tail light out, right? You get a ticket, you can't pay it because you're poor, and then you get enough of them and you end up with a warrant, and you get pulled into the criminal legal system that way, or your driver's license gets suspended, which we live in New York City, so whatever, public transportation, but in a lot of places, I mean, I've talked to students about how if you live in certain places, you'd rather go to jail for a few days than have your license suspended because there's no way you can't go to work. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that is most of the country, Kate. Like I know you grew up in New York. I
grew up in the city, so I really don't know, but
oh no, I mean and this was something that was very jarring for me when I went to college and I met a bunch of people that were like my age and like hadn't gotten driver's licenses. It was completely berserker. Like I was like, how could you I mean, that was like this whole point of pride was like having like, I mean, like, and not a point of pride. It was like, it was a passageway. It was freedom. It was everything.
Right. Well, it's a license to work. I mean,
Well, the other thing I was just actually thinking is like, if you get a suspended driver's license, do you still have a government ID that you can present, or does it say suspended from driving on it? Like, what is that? What? How does that actually work? Do you know?
Right. I'm not
Can you like
sure.
present it to like to fly, or do they like revoke your driver's
Probably, no, I
license?
don't think it gets, I mean, so I guess if it was looked up, it would say like suspended from driving.
Suspended.
I don't know if that
Like, right,
stops
if
you
you
from being
got
able
pulled
to use
over,
it
you would find
at
out.
an
Yeah.
airport or to vote. Or, I mean, that's one of the issues with like voting ID stuff is that a lot of people don't have driver's licenses. And then but there are other forms of identification you can get. It's just a hurdle. And it's
Yeah.
a hurdle for, people who already have a lot of hurdles in their life, created
Yeah.
by government
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. People who already have a lot of hurdles in their life is kind of, I feel like, um, the perfect way to put it. There's so like one of the things that I'm curious about is you said that there were a bunch of alternatives, and I kind of cut you off when we got diverged. But like, what do you think about the other alternatives to kind
To
of
police.
policing? Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to first of all say that I'm not the expert at all in alternatives to policing, but I want to suggest to anyone who's watching that there's a paper about police abolition that's really about police abolition by this woman called Amna Akbar, AKBAR. And in it, she talks about some of these programs, but they're doing all
I'll
sorts.
drop it. I have it. I can like I'll
Oh,
drop it in
cool.
the chat.
I can't remember exactly what the paper's called, but it's really good.
She at
Um,
Princeton?
no, she's at Ohio State. She
Okay.
was at Princeton when she wrote the paper. She was doing a fellowship there.
Oh, okay.
But
Oh, I found her. I found
she's a
her. Yeah.
clinician. She's an organizer. She does a lot of stuff. She's way more
Cool.
like in the world than I am with this
Yeah.
stuff. And anyway, so there's lots of these. There's a bunch of pilot programs in lots of different places. There's a program called Cahoots. And they run them in small cities usually, where basically so one problem is that people don't know who to call. You have a family member in distress, you call 911. Someone is, I mean, I don't condone this at all, but you're irritated by a houseless person, you call 911. Someone's playing the music too loud, you call 911. You get into a fight with your spouse, you call 911, right? So one thing is just to expand the world of options for people, to who they can call when they have a problem that they feel like they need intervention. And some of these services are basically their mental health specialists. So let's just take the mental health stuff. They'll send a mental health specialist out. They send them in a van. There aren't the most important thing, because some of them have carceral solutions at the end, meaning you don't go with these people, you end up going into the system, right? A lot of them don't. So it'll basically be someone who's sent out who's trained in mental health. And the hope, of course, will be to get treatment for the person, but it's not mandated. But what they do is they intervene in the situation in a with a mental health or public health focused way, unlike the police who aren't trained to do so and who are trained to react to folks who are behaving oddly, which is going to be many people in a mental health call situation. So that's one alternative. The other alternative is something like Berkeley, which is no police doing traffic stops, right? So you reduce the police. I mean, in my mind, the police would never be called unless there was an extremely and obviously violent situation. And of course, we can go down a rabbit hole figuring out what that is. But what right now we're not even trying to get there. I mean, after the killing of George Floyd, there was a lot of like defund the police stuff in Minneapolis, and nothing happened. So most people, I think, even if they don't think defund the police, they think let's reduce the police, and instead it's just and a lot of people think the binary is the problem, right? There's the defund people, and then there's the like let's increase the budget people, and a lot of people want something in the middle. I tend to be a little bit more radical about it, but I also see that point. And so there's multiple alternatives, but really the main thing is to figure out ways to reduce police involvement. And sometimes that's going to be another solution, another group, a mental health specialist. And sometimes that's just going to be police don't get involved in this anymore. Police don't get involved for drugs. Police don't get involved for noise pollution. We live with some of the things that annoy us. And some people may not be happy with that.
Well,
Um,
like, let's talk. Okay, so actually, I want to talk about how people use police, white people in particular, but like not always, but people use police to mediate arguments they don't want to have.
right.
Like, like noise pollution, like that type of thing. Like calling, instead of going and knocking on your neighbor's door and saying, "Can you turn the volume down on your on your speaker?" They call the police to come in and mediate this type of thing. That there is like this that actually that like a government state has like enabled, like this very prolific government state has enabled this amount of kind of like lack of personal accountability, and people take advantage of that, and then it leads to deaths, and then people are
Right.
very upset,
Well, and
and
it's
they're
not
like,
just
we
that,
never meant
too.
to like have
Right.
people
It
killed, but
also
like what are
leads
you going to do, like.
Right. Well, it also leads, it leads to death, but I just want to say, like, because sometimes I think these things do get overblown because these situations are so high salience and horrific that we start to feel like the police are killing everyone, right? When they're not, right? There are way too many deaths. There are also many more people whose lives are ruined in other ways by being brought into the criminal legal system, right? You go to jail, you miss work, you're held on bail because you can't pay, you lose your job, you go to jail for, the sentences are ridiculous. I was a public defender, right? I had a client, a 18-year-old kid who got into a fight and took someone's chain off their neck and ended up in prison for 6 years. I mean, it's just, yeah, for robbery. You, you,
That's so
you
awful.
your life gets ruined. And not just you, right? Whole communities. And I'm sure folks who are watching this know a lot of this
Well,
stuff.
did
So
I ever tell you when I was 16 my internship at the public defender's office? Did I ever talk to you about this?
no,
Oh,
go
this
for
is
it.
why I don't do criminal law. Like, this is like 100%. Like, I interned I was only doing I was an intern. I was in high school, and I was an intern for the summer in the public defender's office in Monroe County in Rochester every day. And I did eligibility interviews, and I would get there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and just like eligibility interviews, for people who don't know, is like you take a clipboard and you have a bunch of papers and you go back and you interview every person in the back of, like, in the holding cell waiting to be arraigned, figuring out if they are eligible for a public defender. And it is a crazy experience as a 16-year-old girl, like, to like kind of be standing there and like doing this type of thing, with a lot of different people, and they have different holding, at least at that time in Monroe County, they had different holding cells for women and men, and the women were all there for prostitution, and the men were all there for like burglary tools and
Domestic stuff, drug
domestic stuff. And it was just, and it was consistent, and it was like, and I think about a month into my time there, the same people started to come through again, and I saw the same people, and like the people that I had this like very naive, not naive, like really, I would say like well placed sympathy for, and like kind of like wanted to like help, and I was like, wow, this system is completely failing you. And it was just like I couldn't, and I just decided, I was like, I remember walking away from the experience, and being like, my dad had been a public defender, and like I was like, I
Oh,
can't do
cool.
this for a living. Like, I just like, I will die. Like, I am like such an empathetic person that it'll crush me, and I
Mhm.
can't imagine doing it all the time. I can't separate myself enough. And I think the good people are able to do that. Like,
I don't know
and
if
to
it's
still
good.
have
I
hope.
just thicker skin. I mean, I had a similar thing where I couldn't do trials. I did appeals because the trial work was just too, yeah, it was too painful. I mean, just, having kids as your clients, trying to find witnesses and interview them, and seeing the sort of sad state of everyone's life that you were trying to mess around with. It's horrendous.
I mean, I'll
That said, I
never.
don't want to discourage anyone. I know you
I
said
was,
you have
yeah.
law students who watch, so it's an awesome and super fulfilling job if you
It
can
is
do it,
one
if you've
of
got the
it
skin
is.
for it.
I literally, like, I shake the hands of public defenders the way I shake the hands of veterans. I'm like, thank you for defending our country, because that's how I feel about it. Like, I mean, like, it's literally that kind of job. and it is so hard, and it is like, and they are so overworked and they're so underpaid.
But it's also like super rewarding, and like there's a real,
Yeah, yeah,
solidarity with other people. I think they're like all the public defenders I know actually have like a ton of fun with their colleagues. It's intellectual work. It's, you're on your feet, you're doing trials. So I think, again, I think if you're someone like you, and the sort of empathetic part ruins you, then you can't do it. But there are people who really can, and I think they really enjoy it too.
no, totally. And I do think that, like, even doing it for a short period of time, if you can't do it forever, and not everyone's a lifer, as they say, but like it is one of the most tremendous things that you can do to like learn about the criminal justice system and learn trial advocacy and learn like really how the system works. I mean, it's just I think it's amazing.
I want to
Um,
go back though just quickly,
yeah.
because you had asked about, what we call the police for things like parties, and there's such a good.
Yes.
I know you had Kate Shaw on the show on
Yeah.
Wednesday, and
She's so wonderful.
she's great. This is not about her at all. The
I
connection
know,
is
but like I
Lily's.
just like sorry, she's just like I
She's
just
my
love
colleague. She's
her.
fantastic.
She's a
And
star. She's
but
amazing.
her husband has this podcast. Her husband Chris Hayes has this podcast called WTF, and on it he had this woman, and this is the person I want to talk about, whose name is Mariam Kaba, and she's at the very forefront of the prison and police abolition movement. She's not an academic; she's an organizer. She's brilliant. She writes all the most interesting stuff, and she says all the best things about prison and police abolition. And he did a podcast with her, and on it she talks about this phenomenon of basically being like, and I can relate to this 100%. If my principle not to call the police wasn't so high, I probably would call them, because my principle not to want to talk to my neighbors that I don't know is also really important to me. And she's just like, if you're sitting on your couch and your neighbors are annoying you, like, you have to go and ask them to be quiet. You cannot call the police. And that's
Yes.
just something that like we have to be ripped out of. And the other option, which, I think a lot of us take, is to like really suffer. And that maybe shouldn't happen either, right? Maybe it's possible to be able to have a nice conversation with your neighbors, or to ask them to do something. But
I
but
don't
but
know
calling the
how to
police
like
just can't be an option.
Kate, like this is a broader this actually branches out, I think, to a broader conversation of like this non-confrontational passive polite
The
like
craziest.
Sorry, I'm
kind
getting the
of
podcast just in
are
case
you?
people want to see it. Yeah, I
Oh
think
no, I
you
texted
found
I
it.
put it I
I'm
yeah,
a
I already put it
genius.
into the
I don't
chat.
know why I'm trying to like.
No, that's no, it's so great of you.
Cool.
No, I so it's very interesting. I read a like this is kind of it's going to sound like a little far afield, but I read this really great. I think it was in the New Yorker. I can't remember. It was somewhere that someone wrote up this thing about how to end friendship. Oh, Harper's. And it was like how to end friendships, and it was like if you feel like you have a bad friendship, like.
Call the
And
police.
then I sent a unilateral letter to my friend telling them I ended the like a 15-year friendship, and then I just like walked away, and they were like, and I thought that was okay, and I was like, why would anyone think that that's okay? Like there is just like this. I'm like sometimes you have to talk to people and have a conversation with them. You can't ghost them, or you can't like imagine that the world is going to solve these problems for you if you just continue to ignore them. And if you do think that that's going to be the case, the world might, but it's not going to be solving the problems in the way that you anticipated. So
Right.
like, or
Right.
there's going to be externalities. And so like that I feel like is the way, like, and so like I don't think a lot of people would take the cost benefit of being like, oh well, I called the police and someone might die. Like no, they will they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about the fact that like the music is really loud. They haven't
Right. And
slept for
again, I
2
think the
nights.
cost benefit is, will I call the police because the music is too loud, and will this person life be ruined, right? Just the cost benefit can't be, well, I mean, it's possible someone will die, of course, and that would be the best thing to scare people with on the other side. But the reality is, the real reality is that you can really, and on the other hand, people may get so mad at their neighbors they want to mess with their lives. I just don't. This is the same, going back to the conversation we had about the idea of like our sort of addiction to the criminal legal system. This idea of watching trials and completely divorcing ourselves from sort of the systemic violence on either side.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it is really, I think that it's like one of these things that we have, I think we're kind of actually like, I'm very proud of society for talking about these things so openly finally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I
I
am
know that we
too.
like do a lot of beating ourselves up about how shitty everything is.
Right. No, it's
But
true. I mean, I did say, I do feel that the sort of dialogue that, I mean, nothing makes the killing of someone worth, nothing. One of the things I hate the most is when I see people saying, like, oh, thank you, George Floyd, for sparking this dialogue, which of course is not what you're saying, but like there's something about that. It's like no one should be sacrificing their life, so we had these conversations. But the killing and the protests and the sort of organization, the young folks who got involved, has sparked a conversation. I have some of my like negative Nelly feelings that like it won't end up leading anywhere, particularly because we have this spike in crime, and people are so reductionist about what causes spike in crime that we're now just going to have more police, et cetera. But I agree with you that just like all of a sudden the idea of defund the police is what people are fighting about. And even if we're fighting about it and people are saying that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, it's there. It's not some utopic vision, which when I started teaching, which wasn't even that long ago, you'd just be laughed out of, in academia, you'd be laughed out of the room. And now
in
it's like a very
academia, like in
serious
a
topic.
classroom.
Well, the
Yeah,
classroom, yeah.
I
And in
completely
conversation,
agree.
now my friends are all talking about it. So my
I don't
non-law professor friends.
not no I want like see the chat. There was no part of me that was saying like, "Oh yeah, I'm so glad these people died so that
No,
we
no,
can
no,
have this
no. Sorry,
conversation." I
I
was
wasn't
no.
suggesting the course
I
either.
was just trying to say that like whatever the fuck it was that brought people to the table after literally hundreds of people have died. These are just a number of people that have been very high profile, and I'm not
Right.
diminishing like their loss, but like there have been thousands upon thousands of people exactly like them that have died at the hands of police silently for
And we should
years.
say
And this is like,
mostly, right? Mostly black and brown people, right? Mostly people of
oh,
color. This
sorry.
is
Yes, I
what.
thought that was implicit. Yes, of
No, I
course.
know I
Like
haven't
white.
said it
Yeah.
enough either, though. I think, but I mean, I just feel like that's and it goes along with hundreds of years of, oppression, and often at the hands of at the state
And then like
being
also
the
kind of
force.
like systematic oppression. Like
Right,
you get convicted of a felony, then you can't get government housing, then you
right.
can't get like, you plead out to a
You can't
felony
vote.
because your public defender is overbooked and overworked, and so you plead out to a felony. And so or like, or whatever else, and then you kind of, and I'm
Right.
not putting on the public defender. I'm just
No,
like
and
saying that like this is part of like the, you have 1,000 cases of public defender versus 200.
it's not just
cases.
that, though. Even if
Yeah.
you were a public defender and I'm just like sitting there in my armchair with one case, the cost of going to trial, because the prosecutor has the complete power to charge the person with whatever they want, lump charges together, and the possibility, the exposure people have to sentences if they go to trial is so bad, that most public defenders and most clients are just not going to take that risk. That's why you get innocent people all the time. I mean, all the time, now I'm being hyperbolic, but you get innocent people pleading guilty because the exposure at trial is just so huge. And prosecutors, there's a very famous Supreme Court case. Prosecutors can basically say, if you take this deal, you'll get 5 years in prison. If you don't take this deal for forging a check for 5 years in prison, I'm going to go back and indict you under the three strikes law. You have two other kind of check forging type convictions. I'm going to go back and indict you under the three strikes law, and you will have a mandatory life sentence if you go to trial, right? So that's the deal. It's not like 5 years or maybe 10 years. It's like 5 years now, life in prison if you exercise your right to go to trial. So even with most cases, yes, overworked public defenders is an issue. But with most cases, like you're taking that deal. That's the way
Because
this is
the
the way the
sentencing
argument system
guidelines are
works.
so archaic and just like completely
Right.
insane.
Well, and because prosecutors can stack or do whatever they want with charges, there's total discretion, and the MO of a prosecutor, which should be to do justice, that's their ethical obligation. Instead, the incentive is get as many people in prison for as long as you can. That's what winning is.
Yeah, totally. Christopher Argyris from London. It is so nice to see
Good
you.
evening. Yeah, great to see you both Kates. All Kate.
Yeah. Well, it's like the end of Kate. We're going
Yeah.
out with a bang, right? I feel like it's just Kate's.
Yeah.
All Kate's, except for you.
You need another Kate.
Honorary Kate title today.
Okay, well, the question that I posed, I actually put in at the beginning of the show. and the show went in quite a different direction than talking about qualified immunity. So maybe I don't want to ask that question.
No, but Kate is good about
ask it.
talking about qualified. But you can ask it.
I had this like sort of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I had actually a question since I had two law professors on. Just generally, I was curious. I had just seen, because I'm watching, the context is I'm watching the U.S. Open golf tournament, and I was looking at the Wikipedia page of that, and at the end of the Wikipedia page it says this was also the golf course where Scott Peterson was arrested for the murder of Lacey Peterson in San Diego. And this was a thing that I had covered when I was a journalist.
White people killing white people.
Yes. So I was like, oh, well, I remember saying something about his case recently, even though this was 15 years ago, and I looked it up, and just last spring, his death sentence was overturned and asked to go back. The sentencing asked to be retried because the judge had the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, ruled that the judge had erred in jury selection when they were considering potential jurors' views on the death penalty, and they ruled that he improperly struck off 13 potential jurors, who had indicated that they were against the death penalty, but maybe hadn't said that they wouldn't in any case convict somebody of death if they were on this jury. So the California Supreme Court ruled that the judge, rather than just dismissing the jurors offhand, should have interviewed each of these jurors. And so I'm somebody who thinks, if I didn't have any personal connection to this case, I would generally be in terms of, like, if somebody's on death row, they should have their appeals exhausted. So I just want to generally kind of ask, how often is it some kind of like procedural thing like this which overturns a conviction or overturns a sentence, and it's not like a case of, oh, this person pleads their innocence and they found like DNA evidence. I mean, this seems like a really kind of like a minor mistake by the judge that in my like non-legal mind shouldn't overturn the death sentence. I mean, he could, and they're asking to like retry this again. I wondered, sort of, just for the non-lawyers out there, could you guys sort of explain is this a common sort of thing in like criminal law that overturns, and how would you go about like redoing a penalty phase 14 years later for a case that was settled in like 2004?
Okay, so a lot of times when a decision is overturned in a criminal conviction or death sentence, it's going to be for what we would call like a procedural reason, meaning something went wrong in the procedure. So their lawyer didn't work out, or there was an error. There was very recently, I bet a lot of people saw or listened to the podcast about Curtis Flowers, and he was tried like 8 times with jurors who basically were black jurors were struck off, and that would be considered procedural too. So that's often how it happens, and it's often very hard actually to overturn someone based on innocence. And I'm not going to go into it's complicated, and we don't have time. But basically, once a jury decides something about innocence or guilt, it's extremely difficult to get that part overturned. So it's almost always going to be on a procedural thing, and so that's why you'll see, and of course, the client's lawyers are going to fight anything they can because they don't want their client to be put to death. So it will often be something procedural like that. I just want to say one quick thing about that, which is that doesn't strike me as a small error, because what happens is there's a case called Witherspoon at the Supreme Court, which basically says if a juror is like emphatically against the death penalty, then they can't be on a death case, which has always bothered me, because if you're emphatically pro-death penalty, like you love it, which, sorry, people do, you can be. So I already hate that, but at least people should be able to say, I have qualms with the death penalty, but I wouldn't not assign it, right? And that's what happened here. He kicked off jurors who said, I have qualms, but I might still give the death penalty. So I think of that as kind of a pretty big error, because you basically end up with a jury who are all like rabid, yay, death penalty people. And if you're bothered by that, you should see some of the other procedural reasons people's convictions get overturned, because they can be much, 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 much more minor. Like my uncle wanted to watch the trial, and there's a right to a public trial. And so my uncle didn't get to watch the trial, conviction could be overturned. So there's all sorts of crazy procedural reasons why things get overturned. This is one of the reasons why people get so angry about the way the death penalty is administered, because there are so many appeals, and they go on forever, and often they're thrown out because of these small things.
We have, I love that. We're going to probably run out of time and not going to be able to answer this question thoroughly enough, but I like wanted to get into like the role of like the Scott Hutchinson's like kind of like anti or pro like kind of raising DAs up as kind of like as like the prosecutors as like new mechanisms of progressivism and like things like that. But I wanted to see what you thought about that as like an alternative. But yeah, maybe not. But David Botts, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Greetings, Kate.
Hi.
Please.
Oh, wow.
Please.
Oh, and I'm reunited with Nina. Thank you for
Wow.
that very lovely picture. That's very cute.
So you can call, if you want, it'd just be easier just to call me Kate today in honor of
that.
Kate Week. Okay. Well, thank you, Kate and Kate. What are your thoughts about how the criminal prosecutorial response to COVID-19 may or may not last into 2021 and beyond? For example, Zoom hearings, reduced sentencing, a lot of stuff I perceive has gone uncharged because nobody wanted to go to court. So some of this was on the judges too, not just the
Right.
Totally.
So you frankly may know more like about this. I have a few responses, which are that, I mean, I did some stuff trying to get folks released from prison who were ill and old, who were more susceptible to COVID, which didn't go very far. But I have heard, right, so we've got Zoom trials, and you're right, people probably were charged less. I mean, well, I was hearing, at least in the middle of COVID, that, there was an argument being made, well, look, things haven't gotten worse, despite the fact that we've had people released early and not being charged as much. The problem is with those kinds of arguments is, people are very reductionist. Now we have sort of violent crime has actually spiked in a lot of places, which doesn't mean that these sort of more minor crimes have spiked. But it's hard for me to see the same kind of leniency continuing, early release, not being charged for things, given the sort of spike that we're seeing in violent crime. And it's very complicated why crime spikes, but the responses are very simplistic, and they're often more prosecution, more policing. So, I'm a little skeptical of those things continuing. And one thing I'll also say is the legal system is just always so anachronistic. I don't know if you can bring cell phones into courtrooms yet, but you couldn't when I was going to courtrooms not that long ago. I mean, Zoom trials make so much sense for so many people. I might not like it, actually, frankly, because I want to gum up the works of the criminal legal system. I don't like watching it function so efficiently. It makes me anxious, but it certainly makes so much sense in so many ways to have these, to allow the legal system to function more efficiently, maybe outside the criminal system, with these things. But I would be surprised if they continue. Partially, it's probably because we have a very gray judicial branch, although Trump appointed a lot of young folks, so they're less gray now.
Yeah, it's actually, well, yeah, I haven't heard, by the way, I mean, like, that's in the federal system. Like, I have not heard what it looks like in the state system coming
I think
out.
there was Zoom stuff going on. I have a friend who's a New York City public defender, and he was doing some Zoom stuff. But there were just many fewer trials and many fewer hearings. And as I think it was David said, people were just not being charged with more minor crimes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I could ask my dad, who just like came back from doing 3 trials in a row over the course of like 3 days in Rochester that had been delayed because of the COVID and like.
Is he still public defender?
No, he's now a town justice. So he's just
right.
He is a local town judge.
Huh.
So he does like kind of like these types of things.
Has he been on the show?
No, I will.
You should get him on the show.
No, absolutely. Shut up, Kate. No.
Why not? It could be like
he just delivered me a seltzer. I was like, Dad, will you hand me a seltzer? And he's like, he like silently came in and gave me a seltzer water. But anyways, we have the last question of the day. John, thank you so much for coming on this show. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kate and Kate. So my question is about holding law enforcement to account. And I wonder to what extent the problems in doing so are the result of badly negotiated police union contracts. And if so, what's the path forward?
Yeah, this is a really great question, something that a lot of people in my line of work are struggling with. So some discipline issues are definitely stymied by law enforcement contracts. So to discipline an officer, that means internal discipline, like the police disciplining other officers. The unions throw up a tremendous amount of hurdles to making that happen, including all sorts of procedural hurdles when you're interviewing a police officer, but also once in the very rare occasions where police officers are actually fired. In a lot of places, I know this is true in Florida, I think it's true in other places, the officers can appeal those rulings, as they probably should be able to, but they get appealed up to these arbitrators who are selected by the unions. And in Florida, they were saying something like 90% of these dismissals got overturned. So very, very problematic there. It's much less of an issue in criminal prosecutions. But certainly, given that most discipline is not going to be criminal prosecutions, there are some issues. One thing I like to say is just like a lot of things, the unions have sort of become the villain in all of this. And in some ways it makes sense, right? They are extremely powerful in ways that other unions aren't. But they're similar to other unions in a lot of ways. And there is a huge gap between the captains, the police brass, and the folks who work day to day. And those folks actually, I think, the way a lot of teachers, firemen, all sorts of public sector unions they have the same argument for having a union as those other folks do. So I always kind of caution people to worry or to think, you could be anti-union and then fine, then you've got a coherent vision. But if you're not, you always want to think a little bit about what are the unions doing and how can you maybe get in the way of this, their control over discipline without getting in the way of their control over work conditions and wages and things along those lines. And I don't think it's the police unions that are keeping the police force powerful and violent. I think of that as something that's, again, as I said, a much bigger, wider historical system of sort of the police were invented to sort of oppress poor people and people of color. And I realize that can sound very simplistic and pat, but it happens to be true. And so much of what we see now of the sort of control of poor people by police, you can just draw this sort of straight line. And so I think policing needs to be re-envisioned apart from sort of the idea of the unions are a problem or an individual officer is a problem. All of that said, definitely there's so much interesting work on police unions. I'm just trying to think quickly if I can think of folks Stephen Rushin, John Rappaport.
Well, you find John, I'll find Stephen.
Okay.
But I was
John's
going
in Chicago.
But so this is something that I actually think is I wish and I hope and I really dream that there will be some type of ability in the future to kind of complicate a lot of these problems, which is just it's so refreshing to hear you say and so I wish people would so here's one of the really kind of complicated things I think about all of this, which is you can be pro defund the police, even though it's a terrible slogan, and whatever else, but you can be pro pare down the police, reduce
the footprint,
change their mission, kind of idea.
I want to say that reduce has to be in there somewhere. Change could still mean they're
reduce,
huge and,
lower, yes,
okay.
completely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to come up with the right slogan, but
but no, I get it. And but then there's also just like, oh, well, are you anti-union? Like, all of these people are also in a union. And there's this direct head of progressives and like kind of like classic liberals, which are like, oh, okay, I'm pro-union, but I'm, what do I do?
Anti-police union. Yeah, I'm working on this right now.
But so much about like all of these politics ends up being just very much about like where you're talking about and how you're talking about doing the changes. And I just like wish that those could be complicated, and you can't put it on a bumper sticker. And I wish that more people realize that.
Well, you have so many progressives saying, prison abolition or whatever, and then their issue, be it police violence or domestic violence or white collar crime, comes up, or Harvey Weinstein, and the same people are saying 20 years isn't enough, we need to put these people in prison for even longer, for life, and I'm always just like, those two views don't cohere, and it doesn't mean you can't have them. You just can't say these sort of slogany things and then but then when it's, because if you're a law and order person, it's drug dealers.
Yes.
So I'm working on a paper about this right now. And there's a lot of good work on it in terms of gender violence and things like that. People who are, anti-incarceration until there's sexual assault or domestic violence. And not to say those things aren't horrific, but
almost like we can't
bear in mind the larger goal.
It's almost like we can't boil down all of life into a bumper sticker.
Well, that sucks.
It's just, I know. Yeah, well, yeah, it sucks for the cars, I guess. Anyways, with that, we're going to leave it there. Kate Levine, this was really fun. I've missed you.
Yeah, totally.
I love talking to you about this stuff, and I actually think that this was one of the best. I have a whole bunch of other questions I wanted to ask you about, cameras in courtrooms. I wanted to ask you about funding public defenders. I wanted to ask you about funding prosecutors. I wanted to ask you about all of these things, and we didn't even get there, so we'll have to have you back on.
Definitely. And a lot of other people who are so smart at that stuff that I can recommend to you as well. I mean, not that I don't want to come back all the time.
No. That would be great, but you're just tremendous, and so it was this was a joy. Thank you. Yeah. This was a great way to end Kate Week and Father's Day, so that Ben and Scott could have the day off.
Happy Father's Day to them.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
To my dad, Scott. Awesome. My Scott. My father, Scott.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. So we have okay, it's 23 hours and 59 minutes from now. 22 hours? 23. I don't know. I'm really bad at math. I'm not actually bad at math. I'm just bad at clocks.
On the spot. It's tough.
Yeah. Anyways, we'll be back 23 hours and 59 minutes from now. And until
with a cooking show?
Yeah, we're going to do a cooking show. And until then, Kate, it is no longer Kate Week. Thanks for closing it out. And we don't have fun anymore, but tomorrow we will have cheese curds. So munch, munch, munch. See everybody later. See you later, Kate.